Okay, Rabbi, I want to tell a story.
Let's hear the story. We need to hear the story.
I have a story, about that story.
We brought Rabbi Paltiel all the way from New York. We brought him here, he came, he was about to feel himself. We appreciate it. And it's not to say we get something from who lives inside.
Inside. This is pretty inside. This feels quite inside, I must tell you. I am the luckiest person in the world. I spend my life teaching. Was kann sein besser? All I do is teach Chassidus. And I have opportunities to put my material up. And the stuff goes, I don't even know who I'm reaching. This is my fourth city. Wherever I go, I meet students who I didn't know about.
The ripple effect.
Yeah, it's a very big schus. It's an incredible schus.
I'm your student. I drive 3 hours a week.
What is your name?
My brother. Benji Licht.
And
I listen to your Yossi Kislev for 3 hours.
Oh, thank you very much. I do appreciate it. Thank you. Spread the word.
Chazak.
Huh? Yeah, Baruch Hashem.
That was my Farbrengen in the car.
You have a few Talmidim here.
Thank God. Baruch Hashem. That's my life. That's my life.
Where do you live, Rabbi?
I live here.
In the internet.
I gave it to you last year.
Inside.
Here, pass it to the birthday boy. I live in Crown Heights. My family and I reside in Crown Heights. But I live on the internet. That's my business. That's my chayas. That's my life. While I was in Florida, I recorded several memorim that I'm going to put up. This is my life. So here's my story. This is a story that came out right after Gimel Tammuz.
What's Gimel Tammuz?
Gimel Tammuz was on a Sunday. It was on Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night. That's when, in 1994, the Rebbe passed away. So the following Shabbos, the Kfar Chabad magazine had a black cover. Mamish, a black cover. However they tried to communicate the sense of Avelis. And inside there was a story, a person whose name was Taka Greenwald.
Hello, speak.
A man named Greenwald. I didn't say Tzvi, a Yid named Greenwald. And he tells a story. He says, I am not a Lubavitcher. But I have a story with the Rebbe. It's not Tzvi Greenwald, it's a different Greenwald. I have a story with the Rebbe that I have vacillated back and forth whether I should tell or not, because I can't decide if I'm friend or foe. But now I have to tell my story. And he tells the following story. He was a Yossi, he was an orphan. He lost either one of his parents or both of his parents. Bottom line is, there was nobody at home who was in a position to take care of him. So he was sent to be a shamus, an assistant, by a Yid by the name of Menachem Zembe. The Menachem Zembe, who was eventually killed by the Nazis, Yimach Shmam Zichram, was a Gerach Chassid, a Gaon, an incredible genius of Torah, one of the greatest Goinim of that generation. And this Greenwald boy was 14 years old, and he happened to be his nephew. In other words, through they were related somehow. So when he became an orphan, became a Yosem, when his parents could no longer look after him, he was sent to Warsaw, to Warsaw, to live by Menachem Zembe. So he became essentially an apprentice. He was a boy. So Menachem Zembe took care of him. He gave him food, he gave him clothing, he talked to him. I don't know if he gave him any hugs, but whatever they gave in the 1930s, the equivalent of hugs he gave him, and he raised him. When our Rebbe got married, it was the end of 1928. The previous Rebbe wanted our Rebbe's wedding to be the talk of Poland. He spent an enormous amount of money on that wedding. The Rebbe made 3 weddings, the previous Rebbe. The one wedding, there was no money, they couldn't even afford whiskey. They gave limonade, they served lemonade, they couldn't afford a bottle of mashke. The Rashag.
Where was the Rashag wedding?
In Peyalef, in Rostov. The younger daughter's wedding was a nice wedding in Landarov, which is near Vilna, in Sadik Beis. But the Rebbe's wedding was in Warsaw, and the previous Rebbe invited all the Gedolim of Europe, all the Gedolim, and a lot of them came personally. The Gerer Rebbe sent people, the Belzer Rebbe sent people, and some of them came themselves. On this long list of dignitaries that the previous Rebbe invited to the wedding was also Reb Menachem Zembe, who was the Rav of Warsaw. And he came himself. He came to the wedding, and he came along with his nephew. During the wedding, this Greenwald was a boy of 14 years old. And during the wedding, he went over to the Rebbe, he said, Shalom Aleichem, they talked a minute or two. I don't know if people are aware, one of the greatest Go'onim of that generation was a Jew by the name of Rabbi Meir Shapiro. Rabbi Meir Shapiro was the Rav of Lublin.
He's the one that created
The Daf HaYomi, and he created the Chachmei Lublin. But that, by the wedding, the previous Rebbe sat down and Meir Shapiro right next to the Rebbe. The Rebbe was 26 years old. And he wanted Meir Shapiro to give him his professional opinion on his new son-in-law. So the previous Rebbe is sitting here, the Rebbe is sitting here, and Meir Shapiro is sitting here. Meir Shapiro was very comfortable talking in front of the Frierdiker Rebbe.
What was the Rebbe's father?
He was not by the wedding. He was in Russia. We didn't let him leave. The Rebbe, our Rebbe, was very uncomfortable talking in the presence of his father-in-law. He had such reverence for him. He was already then his chassid. So the Meir Shapiro keeps talking to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe doesn't say a word. So finally, the Meir Shapiro talks over the Rebbe's head to the previous Rebbe, and he says to him in Yiddish, "Ezuk gunish, ezuk gunish." You understand Yiddish? He's saying nothing. Ezuk gunish. So the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, turned to his new son-in-law and said, "Zog, speak." They spoke for about 45 minutes. At the end of the conversation, the Meir Shapiro turns to the previous Rebbe and says, Lubavitcher Rebbe, you took a young man, he was a chassan, he's 26 years old. He's one of the greatest geniuses of the generation. His knowledge of Torah is all of it all, he knows it all. But Rabbi Nachum Zember was not sitting next to the Rebbe. But the Rebbe was known as a great Talmudist, even as a young man. So when Nachum Zember went over to our Rebbe, who was the chassan, to say Mazel Tov, he says, I really didn't have an opportunity to talk to you in any detail. I want a chance to schmooze. I want to chat. Can I come to your hotel? And the Rebbe said, of course, by all means, come tomorrow, we'll chat. Nachum Zember, one of the greatest Goyim of Poland, one of the great geniuses of Poland. So the following day, he came to see the Rebbe, and he took along this Greenwald, this 14-year-old boy with him. And introduced him to the Rebbe. This is my nephew. He's a Yossi. He's an orphan. I'm raising him. So wherever I go, he goes. He was also at your wedding. And they talked for about 45 minutes. Talked for a while. And naturally, they talked. This boy Greenwald had no idea what the conversation was. Like two supercomputers. You know, the language was on a whole nother level. When the conversation was finished, so they're saying goodbye. And the Rebbe turns to this 14-year-old boy, this Greenwald. And he says to him, two Jews meet. You have to say Dvar Torah. You have to say something of Torah, substance. How come it is that Yidden make such a very big deal out of the fifth night of Chanukah? Why do Jews make such a big deal of the fifth night of Chanukah? There's something very special about it. So the Rebbe asks this question to this boy, this 14-year-old, and he immediately says, because the fifth night of Chanukah can never be on Shabbos. And it represents the greatest darkness that could possibly be. But the candles of Chanukah have such a power. That in spite of the darkness, it can take a person out of the worst situation and bring him in the best situation. And he says, whether you live in Warsaw, it's two places, whether you live in Warsaw or in London, in Warsaw or in London, the power of the Chanukah lights can raise a person up in the greatest darkness. And that's the end of the story. This Greenwald grows up, gets married, has a few children, and the war comes. He ends up in the camps. He loses his whole family. His wife dies, his children die. He comes out of the war a broken man, and he ends up in New York. Everybody ended up in New York. So figure, at the Rebbe's wedding in 1928, he was 14. Yeah? So I guess in 1938, he would have been 24, and in 1948 he would have been 34. And he's remarrying. It was after the war. I mean, when you think about the Jews getting married after the Holocaust, there are very few things in our history, certainly in our short-term history, that can compare, in terms of heroism, to the survivors getting married. And I read a book where a guy stands under the chuppah. They got married in the camps, some of them. Mamish in the DP camps.
They wasted no time.
They wasted no time. And they married oddballs. 20-year-old girls married 40-year-old guys. It was just matched them up, and they got married. They built homes. A guy standing under the chuppah. When er hebt on, just a wail. Hebt on schreien, kills brakem. A guy's getting married, that he thought for a moment about what he lost. They got married. They had families. It's not to be believed. The Jewish people, right after the Holocaust, thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews, without thinking for a moment, they got married and they made babies. They didn't practice contraception. They brought the Yiddish Kindlach into the world right after going through the worst tragedy in the Jewish history. They didn't think about what's going to be. There's going to be another Holocaust. Why are we crazy? We're normal. They just got married. So this boy, Greenwald, who lost his wife and his children, he got married a second time. He was connected to Kloisenberger Hasidim. The Kloisenberger Rebbe was one of the most important Jews, post-Holocaust Jews in America. Rabbi Kisil, Yehuda, Halberstam, he was a nephew of the Satmar Rebbe. He was an extraordinary Jew, and a Goan Olam. They say he was a real tzaddik. Abba Madrege.
Who was his uncle?
The Satmar Rebbe was his uncle.
Who was this Greenwald's
The Menachem Zebba, and he was killed by the Nazis. He was a Gerechos. He was killed by the Nazis. So this Greenwald is now in his early 30s, and he's marrying again. And his relatives say, we're Kloisenberger Hasidim. The Kloisenberger Rebbe is going to be at our wedding. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe lives in New York, the previous Rebbe yet. A lot of people, before they get married, especially those who survived the war, they go into him for a bracha. Would you like to go to the Lubavitcher Rebbe for a bracha? So of course he agreed. And his uncle, whoever it was taking him to the chuppah. Parents he didn't have, family he didn't have. So they come to 770.
Not Menachem Zebba.
No, Menachem Zebba geblieben beim Deutsch. This is his nephew.
So who's
this is Greenwald.
Which other uncle? You had another uncle they stayed?
No, yeah, an Andervetter, yeah. A Pashtarit. And they come to 770. They go into the previous Rebbe. And you imagine the Frierdiker Rebbe sat in his room and met one after another. I once was at a Farbrengen with label Zisman Olav Shalom.
Okay.
He wrote a book called I Believe. I would encourage, if there's a book you should read, I Believe. He was 14 years old when the Holocaust was over.
He's in Auschwitz. Okay.
He was in the worst places. But he tells an unbelievably poignant story. Farbrengen once in the 5 towns by Rabbi Velovic, and at the end of the Farbrengen, at like 2 o'clock in the morning, he started talking. What was his name? I Believe. What was his name? Label Zisman. I have 2 hours of him talking non-stop on recording. At the end of the Farbrengen,
We're going to end it too also.
he just talked and he talked and he talked. It's hard to hear him because he was quite distant, but I had enough seichel to keep my mouth shut. And everything in his book I heard face to face, or directly from him. So one of the stories that he tells is that they came here in 46. Jews did not get into America so easy. There was a quota. But they were orphans. He was 14, his brother was 16.
He was the first cousin to listen to
He was at Askin. Yeah, he was at Askin. So they got into America very early, and they were brought to the previous Rebbe. Label, wie heißt der Bruder, der ältere Bruder?
Are we in a story right
A story within a story. So I'll unlose you soon. Label Zisman said to me, he told it to me. He was about 15 and a half years old. He went into the Rebbe with all the elder British in Bedel. It was Bedel and Label. They walked into the previous Rebbe together. The previous Rebbe's speech was impossible to understand. He was, after so many illnesses, his speech was very, very disturbed. I heard a tape of the previous Rebbe, and it's upsetting. It's upsetting to listen to.
Wait a minute. There's recordings.
There's recordings. I have a recording.
But what's the story related to
So you have to be patient. So 1 second, they walked into the Rebbe with Ramesh Leib, with the Rebbe's secretary. Ramesh Leib was Rebbe's secretary. And the secretary stayed in the room to interpret. And the Rebbe asked them questions. They came from Kovna. Kovna was a big city.
in Lithuania?
And Kovna is right near Slabodka. Here's Slabodka, the great yeshiva Slabodka. Slabodka is a suburb of Kovna. And there were a lot of Chassidim in Kovna, a lot of Yidden in Kovna.
Those days Slabodka was the biggest yeshiva also?
Whatever it was. So the Rebbe is asking them questions about the Chassidim from Kovna. And they didn't have one piece of good news. How is so-and-so? He's dead. How is so-and-so? He's dead. How is so-and-so? He's dead. And the Rebbe asked them about all the Chassidim of Kovna, and these two boys had to tell the Rebbe, you, what you're seeing, this is Kovna. There's no Kovna. The great Chassidim in Kovna, they were all killed. We're what's left. The Rebbe asked about each Chassid by name, and when they were done, he turned to his secretary, Rabbi Leib, and he asked him to leave. So the secretary walked out, and he closed the door. And the Rebbe's doors, if you know 770, the doors have very, very strong locks. You can hear it click when it closes.
But the office was upstairs.
Second floor.
Yes.
When that door clicks, it's locked. And you cannot get in from the outside without a key. And Label told me that the Rebbe, previous Rebbe, watched Rabbi Leib walk out and watched him close the door. Now Moshe Leib didn't want to close the door. He wanted to stay inside. He wanted to know what was going to happen. And the Rebbe waited until he heard click, which means that he can't come in anymore. And the Rebbe started crying. The Rebbe started to cry. And Label told me, when the Frierdiker Rebbe would cry, his body would tremble like a washing machine in a spin cycle where the clothing and that his whole gewatz getreselt. And the Rebbe started to cry. So he said, we stood there. They were 15 and 17 years old. They were kids. And the Rebbe cried, and we cried. It was cathartic, as they say. For a meshach zman, I don't know how long it was. They cried for some time, and then the Rebbe stopped crying, and they walked out. The Rebbe had, previous Rebbe probably replayed this tape with 1,000 Jews. People came in, and as ill as the Frierdiker Rebbe was, he would greet them, and he would love them, and he would ask questions, and then he would cry. He would cry for the Churban HaEuropa. But the more important thing was he cried with the living. He wasn't crying with the dead. Label said to me that those tears that he himself cried together with the previous Rebbe healed him. It was a therapy. It was a healing. So now we go back to the original story. You understand? I'm sorry I digress, but I hope you don't mind that I did. Greenwald goes into the previous Rebbe, and he tells the Rebbe he's getting married, and he tells the Rebbe, I lost my wife, I lost my family, I'm remarrying, and the Rebbe was very loving, unbelievably gentle and kind.
He went to the
previous Rebbe.
What was it before?
48. And then he tells the previous Rebbe, 19 years ago I was at the wedding of your daughter. And the Rebbe lights up like a bulb. You were in Warsaw Chassidut. My son-in-law is downstairs. Go in and say hello. So when he walked out, the previous Rebbe, he went downstairs into the Rebbe's room. And as soon as he walked in the door, the Rebbe says, "No, it's been 20 years." The Rebbe's memory was impeccable. It's been 20 years, we're meeting again. He couldn't believe that the Rebbe remembered him. He was a boy of 14. And they chatted a little bit about the wedding. And the Rebbe was very kind to him. And as about to leave, the Rebbe says, when two Jews meet, you have to say Advar Teilen. Why is it that we make such a big deal on the 5th night of Chanukah? And this guy Greenwald almost falls down. It's exactly the same words that Rebbe told him 20 years before. So he was so overwhelmed. Before he could say a word, the Rebbe says, because the 5th night of Chanukah can never be Shabbos. And it shows on the greatest darkness. And that the power of the Chanukah Licht can schlep a year in the worst conditions. And the Rebbe says to him this time, whether you live in New York or in London, the Chanukah candles can take you out of the worst scenarios and bring you back to the Eibishter. This guy Greenwald walks out of the Rebbe dizzy. The Rebbe was not the Rebbe, he was then only the son-in-law of the previous Rebbe. But the Rebbe remembered and gave him again, verbatim, the same Vatera he had given him 19 years before. This man gets married, he moves to Toronto, and he establishes his family, his children. But the family, the community to which he belonged, wasn't so in favor of Lubavitch, because they felt that Lubavitch was too open-minded. They're being makan of all these secular Jews, and he was a very Satmar-like, a Hasidic group that didn't like the fact that we were embracing of all Jews. But he knew that he has this special relationship with the Rebbe, so he wasn't going to open his mouth to defend the Rebbe, but he wouldn't support the criticism. It's 1969. It's 21 years later. His son is now getting married in New York. He calls up 770 and he says, I want to make an appointment to see the Rebbe. I'm sure, 6 months. He says, no, the wedding is next week. He says, sorry, sir. He says, you don't understand. I was at the Rebbe's wedding. And 20 years ago when I got married, the Rebbe saw me. I need to see the Rebbe this week. So somehow the Rebbe was consulted and the Rebbe said, yeah, you gotta let him in. So the secretary says, you can go into the Rebbe, but you have to promise.
No one
Like a guy, like a chaver going to the mikveh. It's no questions. You go in and you go out. Deal. He walks into the Rebbe's door with his son. And the Rebbe says to him, no, 20 years have passed. Time do we meet again? The last time they met was 20 years before, and the Rebbe told him exactly the same words. The Rebbe was happy to see him. They had a beautiful exchange. We gave him the best brachas. And the greatest bracha, my father explained this to me, and my father understands. My father's older than I am. You give a Holocaust survivor a bracha, that he should dance at the chasna of this boy's son. You imagine? Wow. A Holocaust survivor, the Rebbe's bracha was, you will dance at the wedding of his son. And then he says, Rebbe, I was told that I'm not allowed to ask any questions. Can I ask a question anyway? So the Rebbe says, the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe sends you to me, I have to answer all your questions. So he says, Rebbe, it doesn't really bother me, but I'm surrounded by people who really don't like what Lubavitch is up to. That they're Makarav Jews who are not religious, they're bad, and you're supposed to hate them, and you're supposed to push them away, and you're not supposed to support them, you're not supposed to lift them up, you're not supposed to embrace them. On and on and on and on and on. What can the Rebbe tell me about this? And the Rebbe talks to him in Yiddish. And he says to him, your neighbor, this fanatic, this zealot, who's all upset that Lubavitch is embracing people who are irreligious. Tell me something. The Rebbe says to him, if it was one of his own children, would he say, you're not allowed to look into the face of an evil person? Also, l'stakal b'nei Rasha? Or would he say, B'sarcha al tasalam, don't ignore the bleeding of your own flesh and blood? I'm asking you, the Rebbe says to him, your neighbor, who's giving you a hard time, and the Rebbe knew that it was his neighbor without him saying, because Lubavitch is so bad. If it was his child, would he say, also l'stakal b'nei Rasha, not look at the face of an evil person? Or would he say, don't, and then the Rebbe said very emotionally, very loud, but the Rebbe, dem Shveders, jede Yid gewem b'sarcha. By the previous Rebbe, every Jew was his flesh and blood. And he couldn't let him get lost. Sure. And then the Rebbe says, no, when two Jews meet, you got to say it. How come the fifth night Chanukah can't be Shabbos? How come it makes the fifth night Chanukah? And the guy was overwhelmed. It's the third time in 40 years. And the Rebbe's telling him the same Varteira. And he gives him the same answer, that the fifth night Chanukah can't be Shabbos. And it reflects the greatest darkness. And it indicates that if a Jew is lost in the greatest darkness, the power of the Chanukah candles can bring him back. And this time the Rebbe says, whether he lives in Toronto or in London, the koyach of the Chanukah Licht can bring him back. Right? And he leaves. Now it's this story happened in 1968. Now it's 1979. He's on his way to London to a wedding of a relative. And his neighbor pulls him aside and says, listen, I need a favor. I know you got a connection to Lubavitch. I know you're an insider with those Michigan. I have a daughter living in London. And she's living with a guy. And she's planning to marry him. You're going to be in London for a few weeks. Try to find her. See if you can get Lubavitch. All of a sudden Lubavitch became kosher to break this engagement. So he goes to London and he meets Rabbi. What's his name? Rabbi Glick. His name was Rabbi Glick. Right? He was a Scottish Jew. He was a very interesting man. You knew him, right? His relationship with the Rebbe he was a professional. He was a businessman. He was a smoker. He was a cigar smoker. He was one of those. He was a cosmopolitan fellow. He was a very, very cool guy. Really, he was very rich.
He was a cool dude.
He was very, very worldly. And he was a chassid. Is that a fair assessment of him? He was one of the richest. He was a very rich man, but he did the Rebbe's work in his very cool way. He was a Lubavitcher, but not like you and
No,
me.
he wasn't born. He came. He was from Vienna. Originally.
He was a very sophisticated cultural guy.
He touched business turned out well.
Yeah, but he was a Rebbe's a mensch. He had an open door. But him and the Rebbe were best buddies. Anyway, this fellow Greenwald came to London and he started to dabble with Lubavitch and he got the glick. And he says to Glick, listen, I'm here looking for a pin in a haystack. There's a girl in London, her last name is such and such, I don't know where she is and what she's doing, but she's hanging out with a guy and we gotta save her. So Glick says, I'll see what I can do. Anyway, he does what he has to do. And he stayed in London for a few weeks and Glick calls him, come to my house now. Achshav. He rolls into his house and the girl is on the couch, she's sitting there. He found her. I don't know what he did, but she was ready to go home. She was ready to go back to her family, which was a huge miracle. And it was Chanukah, and there were 5 candles burning on the Menorah. He walks into this person's house, and there's 5 candles burning on the Menorah. It's a story. Wait, but the story doesn't end. He came to Dollars in 1992 as an old man for the wedding of his grandson. Just the way the Rebbe promised, his oldest grandson. And he came for Dollars. I don't know how, but he told the Rebbe the story. How the Rebbe at his wedding in 1928 had told him that a Jew is lost in London. You understand? So he tells the Rebbe the story. Sorry. Anyway, the Rebbe's answer to him was, the Shver hat gehabt, I can cook. You understand Yiddish? The Shver hat gehabt, my father-in-law could see very far into the future. How his father-in-law lines in that story, nobody knows. But that's what he said. The Shver hat gehabt, I can cook. My father-in-law could see far. The man died right after Shem Brachas. He managed to live long enough to see the wedding of his first grandson. That's the story. That's the story. It's a beautiful, it's an amazing story. So this was printed.
Generational story.
It was printed right the week after Gimel Tammuz. It was printed in the Kvachabad magazine with a name. It says the name Greenwald.
Why did he say that? I don't know if I should say the story.
He was more Satmar. He wasn't sure if he loved. A lot of people loved the Rebbe. They didn't like his Hasidim. And as far as the Rebbe was concerned, we were a package. If you don't like the Hasidim, you don't like me. If you like me, you like my Hasidim. He was on the fence. He decided to tell the story after Gimel Tammuz. It's a remarkable, it's an unbelievable story. And it's the story of Chanukah Licht. I think it's fair to say, this is something interesting. What is the mitzvah? I'm asking a question rhetorically. What is the mitzvah that a Jew in the Western world, a secular Jew in the Western world, is most likely to keep? I'm asking you a question. No. No. I'm so surprised. What is a mitzvah?
Oh, a mitzvah.
I'm sorry, a mitzvah that the Jew in the Western world is most likely to keep.
Jew?
Yeah, of course.
Bris.
No, bris. Bris Milah, that's the answer. And if you think about it, it makes the least sense. Of all the mitzvahs, now they're calling it mutilation, they've got names for it, don't ask. There is no mitzvah that more Jewish people keep than bris. And the reason is, what's the reason? What is the reason? See, you're Sephardim, you don't understand how cold Ashkenazim are. You don't understand. No, it's not funny.
He's not funny. He's not funny.
You're an Ashkenazi. You got the complexion. You get Sephardi.
They're all Ashkenaz.
They're all Ashkenazi. Ashkenazi, it's possible to be a Jew and not to identify as such. It's hard for them to understand. But bris they keep. Jews keep bris. You know why we keep bris? Because we love to make our rabbis wrong. It's our favorite pastime. We love to make our rabbis wrong. Eliyahu HaNavi said, "Ubrischa Yitzeinu." What Elijah the prophet said 2,500 years ago, more, that the Jews have violated the covenant. The Reformed Jews said, "We're going to do this one just to make him wrong." You understand? Just to make him wrong. The most frequently practiced mitzvah, I don't think it's a question, is Bris Milah. And if you think about it, it makes no sense. Because the modern world with all of its new ideas, they're all over it. But Yidden do a bris. But you could make a real case that the second most frequently practiced mitzvah is Chanukah. More than Pesach, Perhaps even more than Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Now, the explanation is, like there's 1,000 stories. The kid goes to school and everyone has a tree, and Uncle, what's his name, Claus is going to visit, and the Jewish kid wants to know why he doesn't have a tree and why there's not going to be a gift under the tree on the 25th. So Navach, the parents have no choice. So you remember the Hasofers, you know the story of the Hasofers? So they make a Chanukah Menorah. They want to have a tree, huh? Chanukah, no, they make a Menorah. You know the story with the Hasofers?
The other way around, huh?
You know the story with the Hasofers? It's a crazy story. There was a family, this is a true story, also a true story. The one I told is true, this one is also true.
No, it's the old true, but some you hear first.
Some happened and some didn't happen.
No, some you hear first hand, or second hand. Or third.
It's Hashem. But the story with Hasofer goes like this. She, Professor Hasofer and his wife, she was also a big professor, she was a psychologist. Ardent Zionists. And they loved Israel. And they loved the Medina. They moved to Israel probably before the war. And they were very into the cause. And then Israel became a state. And like it or not, when Israel became a state, there was the P word, right? Politics. And politics and the T word, truth, don't fit in the same universe. So this couple who had dedicated themselves and had given so much to the establishment of Israel were very disappointed. Because the leaders were grabbing power. They weren't talking about the state, they were grabbing power. Everyone wanted leadership. And of course, they're not chas v'shalom grabbing power because they want power. They want to help the state, but they know best. I know better, so I got to be in charge because I know best. They were very turned off. They were so turned off by what happened in the 50s in Israel, they left the country. Tzionim, Zionists, they left the country.
Why would they turn off?
Because of politics. And they decided they have to move to a place where they can completely lose their identity as Jews.
It's politics all over.
You're shocked and surprised. But they were ideologues, they were idealists.
So they thought wherever they're going to move, there's not going to be politics?
No, they're not going to fight for it. So they moved to New Zealand. Not to Australia, chas v'shalom, that's too big a country. To New Zealand. They figure New Zealand is so far away, they'll have no Jewish identity. They'll become totally assimilated. They'll raise children who are vanilla, without an identity at all, and they'll clean their conscience from their dedication to a cause that disappointed them. And they moved to New Zealand and they start making babies. What's the problem making babies? You want to make babies too, they don't stay little. They get big really fast. Really, really, really fast. So when they're very little, they're wonderful, right? And sweet. And the biggest problem they make is 15 minutes late for bedtime. But that doesn't last. Anyway, the kids started growing up and the kids going to school. So where are they sending him to? They couldn't send him chas v'shalom to a public school. The education was inferior. They were both intellectuals. So they sent him to a Catholic school, to a private school with a good education, where they would learn well and they would be able to get into good colleges and so on and so forth. But in the meantime, they had to learn about the guy hanging on the wall in the front of the building, And the parents were prepared to put up with that. They should learn about the guy hanging on the wall. They should get a good education. But then comes the holiday season, and all their friends have trees, and there's so much discussion in school about the Savior, and they have nothing. Nothing. They were atheists. They were secular.
They have no savior.
They have nothing. They have nothing. And the kids come home and they say to their parents, everybody has a bush. We need a bush too. And the most important thing, he has to visit and leave us gifts under the tree. That's the most important thing. The old joke about a Jew who was an atheist who would kick up from Catholic school, and he says, Papa knew, there's the Father, and then there's the Son, and then there's the Holy Ghost. So the father grabs the child by the shirt and says, Moshe, there's one God, and we don't believe in him, you understand? We don't believe in him. So these parents didn't know what to do. The kids came home and they complained. So reluctantly, the parents said, okay, we'll make him a Menorah. And they told them that we're Jewish, but we really don't believe in God. We're atheists, we're secular. We want something, we're not putting up a tree. They got wind of the fact that the city, I don't know what the capital of New Zealand is. Karachi, I don't know the name of the place.
Auckland.
Auckland. Auckland. There was some kind of Jewish community. Nobody was religious. And there was some fellow who had come from Israel, and he acted in lieu of a rabbi, and he left. So they called the Professor Asofer, and they said to him, "We need you to be a rabbi." He says, "I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God." He says, "That's fine. How can I be a rabbi if I don't believe in God? Because you know how to read Hebrew. We have these Hebrew books. Nobody knows how to read them. You don't have to believe a word. Just read. Just read. We'll believe. You read. You'll read." So Professor Asofer, with his wife and his children, they would get together occasionally, and he would read. Anyway, they would get together and they would have gatherings, and the people would sing, and he would sing along, and he knew how to read Hebrew. He didn't believe one word of the whole business. He was a real atheist, but they wanted him to read Hebrew, so he read in Hebrew. But you understand how these things go. One thing leads to another. So they had that. The only book they had was the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. It's the worst book. It's the biggest turnoff in Judaism. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. For a secular Jew, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, it's full of rules. Don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this. You're going to turn into a pumpkin. And that's all they had. He understood Hebrew, and he would translate this book, and that was it. But that was all they had. They had a Siddur, and a Chumash, and a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. And slowly the children didn't have their parents' history. The children took to it. The children started to enjoy it. And the children started asking questions. And the father says, "I don't believe in any of this. Why are you asking me?" And the child says, "I don't know what else to ask." So the story is that one Shabbos afternoon, Saturday afternoon, they were sitting in their home, and their oldest son or daughter was harassing their father to answer his questions. And the father would say, "This whole thing is hocus pocus. I'm only doing it to please the people." And the kid says, "But listen, I need answers." So the father says, "You know what? Let's pray. Let's pray. Maybe there's a God." But if you look in the Bible, look in the Chumash, it says that there's somebody called Moses. And Moses is the Redeemer. If there is a God, there's probably a Moses. And if there is a God and there is a Moses, we'll pray that Moses should come to us and answer your questions. So on Shabbos afternoon, Mr. Asofer and his son sit down and they talk to a God that they're not sure exists. They say, "Listen, if you're out there and there is a Moses, send him to us, because we got questions without answers." This is Shabbos. The next day, Mr. Asofer goes out into some kind of a public square and he sees a rabbi with a beard. Who does he see? Rabbi Chaim Gutnick from Melbourne, Australia, is in the center of this Auckland in New Zealand, and he looks lost. He looks like he doesn't know where he is. So Professor Asofer was a big, burly man. He runs up to him and he gives him a bear hug. Rabbi Gutnick was a bit taken aback by being embraced by a bear, but he says, "Rabbi, we're looking for you. We have questions. You have to come to our home." Anyway, he goes to their home. He answers all their questions. It was the first of many meetings. He sent them books. They stayed in touch, and they became from. Asofer decided to keep practicing mitzvahs, and somehow their parents found God. They moved from New Zealand to Sydney, Australia. 20 years later, many years later, the rabbi in Sydney, the shliach in Sydney's name is Rabbi Feldman. Vinny Feldman. His wife is Rabbi Gutnick's daughter. So the two of the girls are talking. And Professor Asofer's daughter says to Rabbi Feldman's wife, Miss Rabbi Gutnick's daughter, "The funniest thing happened." No, it goes the other way. She, Mrs. Feldman, says to Professor Asofer's daughter, "One day my father gets a message from the Rebbe. Go to New Zealand." It was a Saturday night, right after Shabbos in New York, so it was already Sunday in Australia. A telegram arrives from the Rebbe to Sydney, to Melbourne, to Chaim Gutnick. "Go to New Zealand." My father gets on a plane. He travels to New Zealand. He gets out of the airport, and a strange man walks up to him and gives him a bear hug, brings him to his home. And Asofer says, "You don't understand. That was my father." It took him a whole generation to piece these two parts of the story together, that they prayed on Shabbos, that if there is a God, and there is a Moshe Rabbeinu, he should come and answer their questions. The Rebbe immediately sent Rabbi Gutnick to Auckland. They met the next day. That's a story. There's a story. The story with the Rebbe. Yeah, it is goosebumps. It's a story with the Rebbe. It's a story with the Rebbe. Anyway, so Chanukah is probably the second most frequently kept mitzvah. And the official reason is because since it's the holiday season and all the other children are getting gifts because it's, Uncle Santa is coming to visit, whatever, Uncle Claus is coming to visit. So the Jews have their own uncles, their own, whatever the arrangement is. The children should not feel deprived. But the flip side of it is that Chanukah touches the Neshama Vayid almost as deeply as Bris Milah. It's not as deep as Bris Milah. Brizanya is number one, uno. He said Moses got the message.
And he sent you a shua.
Toich K'dei Dibur.
Right.
Abrizanya.